Before the blade fell on the neck of France's most hated queen, her enemies subjected her to one last calculated performance of cruelty. They didn't just want to execute her, they wanted to erase her. Her journey from a gilded throne to a wooden cart, paraded through streets where her former subjects screamed for her blood, was designed to strip away every last piece of the queen. But they failed. This is the story of what they did to Marie Antoinette in her final hours, and the surprising dignity she clawed back in the face of utter degradation. Forget the glittering hall of mirrors at Versailles. Our story begins in the damp, rat-infested cell of the Conciergerie prison in Paris. This medieval fortress, nicknamed the antechamber to the guillotine, was the last stop for enemies of the French Revolution. On the night of August 2, 1793, after months imprisoned with her family, Marie Antoinette was ripped from her children and sister-in-law and brought here alone. For 76 days, the former Queen of France was no longer a queen. She was simply prisoner number 280. Her cell was a miserable, cramped space with dripping walls and a single straw mattress. Privacy was a long-forgotten luxury. 2 guards were stationed in her cell around the clock, their eyes glued to her every move. They watched her eat prison slop. They watched her try to sleep. And they watched as she struggled to change her clothes behind a flimsy screen. This constant surveillance was a weapon, a tool of dehumanization, the ultimate insult for a woman who once commanded private palaces. But the physical squalor was nothing compared to the psychological torture. Just a month earlier, revolutionary guards had stormed her room at the Temple prison at midnight. They had come for her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. Accounts describe a frantic mother throwing herself between the guards and her child, begging them not to take him as her teenage daughter, Marie-Therese, clung to her brother, screaming. But they tore the boy from her arms. She would never see him again. All she had left of him was a small portrait and a lock of his hair hidden in her corset. It wasn't the loss of her crown that defined her final days, it was this profound, crushing grief of a mother. Her maid, Rosalie Lamerlier, who looked after her in the Conciergerie, would later say that the only time the queen ever truly broke down and sobbed was when she spoke of her children. In mid-October, the final act began. On October 14, 1793, Marie Antoinette was hauled before the Revolutionary Tribunal for a trial that was really just a piece of political theater. Unlike her husband, Louis XVI, who had weeks to prepare a defense, the queen was given less than a day. The charges were a wild mix of political conspiracy and lurid tabloid fantasy. Much of it ripped straight from the slanderous pamphlets that had demonized her for years. She was accused of funneling French money to Austria, of planning massacres, and of hosting depraved orgies at Versailles. But the final accusation was so venomous, so clearly designed to annihilate her very character, that it stunned even some of the hardened revolutionaries in the room. The prosecution, led by the fanatical Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, accused her of incest with her own son. They had manipulated little Louis Charles, forcing him to sign a statement against his mother. For a moment, the queen was silent. The courtroom buzzed. Then she stood. She didn't look at the judges or the prosecutors. She turned to the gallery, packed with the working-class women of Paris, the same women who had once howled for her death. In a clear, unwavering voice, she said, "I appeal to all mothers present in this room." It was a brilliant move. For one stunning moment, she wasn't the hated Austrian or Madame Deficit. She was a mother defending her honor against an unspeakable lie. You could feel the mood in the room shift. The women in the crowd, mothers themselves, started murmuring in her defense. It was a flicker of her old power, a reminder of the woman who once held the court in the palm of her hand. But it was only a flicker. The verdict was never in doubt. In the early hours of October 16th, after a 2-day trial, the all-male jury found her guilty of high treason. The sentence was death. When asked if she had anything to say, Marie Antoinette just shook her head. What was there left to say? Back in her cell, she refused the final meal. "I need nothing now, my child," she told her maid Rosalie. "Everything is over for me." Calmly, she picked up a pen and wrote a final, heartbreaking letter to her sister-in-law, begging her to forgive her son for the testimony he was forced to give. That letter was never delivered. It was intercepted by her enemies and found years later. As dawn broke over Paris, the physical humiliations began, each one carefully planned. The guards ordered her to take off the black mourning dress she'd worn since her husband's execution. That dress was a symbol of her status, her history. Instead, they forced her into a threadbare white shift, the simple garment of a penitent, not a queen. To change, she had to plead with a guard to turn his back for just a moment of privacy. He refused. Then came the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson. One of his assistants grabbed a handful of her hair. Once piled high and decorated with jewels, it had turned prematurely white from the stress. With a pair of rough scissors, he hacked it from her head. It was a deeply symbolic act meant to strip her of her femininity and status, but it also served a practical purpose, to ensure a clean cut for the guillotine's blade. Next, they bound her hands cruelly behind her back. "They did not bind my husband's hands," she protested, a rare spark of defiance. Her plea was ignored. The ropes were pulled so tight they caused her obvious pain. Reduced to the most basic human needs, she had to humbly ask her captors for permission to relieve herself in a corner before they took her away. At 11 a.m., the gates of the Conciergerie creaked open. Her husband, King Louis XVI, had been granted the dignity of a closed carriage for his final ride. For the Queen, there would be no such courtesy. A crude open wooden cart, the kind used for common criminals, was waiting. They forced her onto a plank, hands still bound, completely exposed to the city. The journey to the Place de la Révolution took over an hour. The streets were packed with tens of thousands of people, a sea of hostile faces. They jeered, they spat, they screamed insults. The famous revolutionary artist Jacques-Louis David sat on a balcony, sketching her as she passed, capturing her haggard, defiant profile. The cart jolted so violently at one point that it almost threw her from her seat. Through it all, Marie Antoinette sat ramrod straight, her face a pale, proud mask. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just stared straight ahead, a solitary figure of composure in a hurricane of hate. Finally, the cart rumbled into the Place de la Révolution, what we know today as the Place de la Concorde. In the middle of the square stood the guillotine, its tall frame a stark silhouette against the October sky. The crowd surged, hungry for the bloody finale. As Marie Antoinette stepped down from the cart, something seemed to shift. Despite the relentless campaign to break her, eyewitnesses described her as calm, composed, almost graceful. She walked up the wooden steps of the scaffold alone, refusing the executioner's help. As she reached the top, in a final bizarre twist of fate, she accidentally stepped on the foot of her executioner, Charles Sanson, the man who had just cut her hair, bound her hands, and was seconds away from ending her life. For a moment, all eyes were on them. Without a hint of fear or anger, she leaned toward him and spoke her final words, a quiet, simple apology. "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it." It was an extraordinary moment of grace. That small act of courtesy, of basic human decency in the face of monstrous cruelty, was her ultimate, unexpected act of defiance. It was a declaration that they could kill her, but they couldn't destroy who she was. At exactly 12:15 in the afternoon, the blade fell. It was swift. Sanson's assistant grabbed her severed head by its white hair and held it up for the crowd. A massive roar erupted from the thousands gathered. "Long live the Republic!" Her body was unceremoniously loaded back onto a cart and taken to a nearby cemetery, where it was thrown into an unmarked mass grave. The revolutionaries had tried to erase her, burying the last Queen of France like a commoner with no honors. And here's a final macabre legend. It is said that the artist who would become famous as Madame Tussaud was called in to make a death mask from the Queen's severed head, a ghoulish story that has followed her ever since. It would be more than 20 years before her story got its final chapter. In 1815, after the monarchy was restored, King Louis XVIII ordered the exhumation of his brother and sister-in-law. Their remains were painstakingly identified and finally given a proper royal burial in the Basilica of Saint Denis, the final resting place of French kings and queens. The French Revolution set out to destroy a symbol of royal excess. They subjected Marie Antoinette to every humiliation they could think of, stripping her of her title, her family, her dignity, and finally her life. They wanted the world to see a monster. But in those last moments, with a quiet apology to her own executioner, she denied them their final victory. They took her crown and they took her head, but they could not take the shocking dignity she showed them before the blade fell.